There is only one Doom. Of course, there's like 7 Dooms if you just count mainline games. And Doom is probably the most often copied, imitated, and iterated on game of all time. And at this point, it's not even really close. But the same thing rings true. There's only one Doom in that despite how many other games feature fast and weighty FPS combat through hellish alien levels, crunchy weapons capable of making your demonic enemies explode into giblets, and an intense focus on fun and just the joys of playing a video game over really anything else, there is just something that makes Doom special. And despite how many iterations the game has gone through over its 32 years of existence, it's always easily and immediately identifiable as Doom. Now, once again, we are staring down the barrel of another bold new take on Doom in the Dark Ages. But before that happens, I figured that there has never been a better time to revisit the 2 modern entries into the Doom franchise, Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, seeking a fresh perspective on them before our conceptions of what a modern Doom game looks like get completely shaken up once again. Now, it almost feels wrong to say, but this is the first time I've made a dedicated Doom video on my main channel. It almost feels like that can't possibly be true because a lot of you probably do associate this channel with Doom in some way, be it because I talk about it and reference it pretty often, or because of my second channel where I've done a lot of Doom related content, but nope, never here. Despite how important Doom has been to me and just my general online existence, with Doom 2016 even being the first single-player game that I ever streamed, I just never really felt like I had anything much that I really needed to say about it. But some time has passed since my last brush with modern Doom in general, and the landscape of FPS games, particularly indie FPS and boomer shooters, have changed drastically in the wake of the 2 modern Doom titles in such a way that has really recontextualized these 2 games considerably. At the end of the day, most surprising of all is that Doom 2016 and Eternal, with the Dark Ages soon joining that list, are still really the only examples of AAA boomer shooters, and in a lot of ways are still paving the way for other FPS games in this vein. And so on the eve of the Dark Ages coming along, and once again shaking up everything, there has never been a better time to take a close look at these titles, reevaluate some of what they're bringing to the table, and just appreciate the ride that we've been on this past decade with one of gaming's most iconic franchises, Doom. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'll be doing a full replay of both Doom 2016, Eternal, and its DLCs, which I've actually never played before. I'll be playing it all on the Ultra Violence difficulty, since I believe it delivers the most quintessential and balanced challenge for both games, at least for me. All along the way, I'll be sharing my thoughts, gameplay moments, and summing up my experience with modern Doom in 2025 and what it might tell us about where the franchise is heading as it enters the Dark Ages. And just in general, paying some much overdue love to this franchise that, despite being so important to me, has somehow never meaningfully appeared on my channel. So let's do it. Now, without too much hyperbole, Doom 2016 might actually, in a weird way, be the single most important game to this channel of all time. And I'm not kidding. More important than Ultra Kill, more important than Dark Souls, Elden Ring, more important than Rainbow Six Siege, the game that prompted me to start this channel all the way back in 2018 in the first place. And the reason is, well, kind of convoluted, but I do feel confident saying that this game that I had previously played through one time in a single 10-hour playthrough on the second lowest difficulty did actually alter my perspective on FPS games in such a way that created a domino effect that made this channel what it is today. I grew up with FPS games being some of my first favorite games. But more specifically, it was console FPS games like Halo, Call of Duty, and the 007 games. I was aware of the existence of PC FPS games like Doom and Quake, but I just had no first-hand exposure to them. And while I loved the campaigns of these console FPS games like Halo, my experience of many of these games was actually defined by the multiplayer component. And from then on, FPS games to me were like social experiences first and foremost. And this rang true to me for a long time. Through college, where I was too busy to sink a lot of time into solo gaming, and then after college, as me and all my friends scattered across the country a bit, we continued playing primarily multiplayer FPS games like Rainbow Six Siege to keep in touch. In March of 2020, Doom Eternal released. and it looked really interesting to me. And I all of a sudden had tons of time for gaming, being stuck inside without much to do. But still, I wasn't sure about spending $60 on it, and I passed on it for a while. For the early days of lockdown, my gaming was definitely much more focused on social gaming, and it remained that way for the next year or so. I started streaming in early 2021, where playing the same type of game with my friends was the primary focus of the early days of my stream. But as the year went on, burnout on this type of multiplayer FPS started to really hit hard. And I realized I was going to have to branch out at least a little bit if I wanted to keep doing this streaming and content thing. So I dug into my Steam library a bit, and a little game called Doom stuck out to me. Doom 2016 was the first single-player game I streamed. And by my standards today, my streams of this game are unwatchable. I had no idea what to say or do on stream without friends or teammates to bounce off of. And at that point, certainly nobody was in chat, but I just played. And I had an absolute blast regardless. Even despite thinking at first that it would just be a quick time filler between sessions of Rainbow Six Siege, it became so much more than that. Now I say all of this because I'm sure some people watching this are real Doom fiends, having grown up with the games, played every single one of them multiple times, and learning them inside and out. And this is just not me. I am a huge poser in comparison, and I am not afraid to admit that. But it is a testament to how powerful Doom is as a concept that one extremely casual playthrough of Doom 2016 could have changed my view of the FPS genre and unknowingly the trajectory of my content and my life substantially. It left me with such a strong impression and a desire to experience a whole sector of the FPS world that was previously unknown to me. It, as well, seems a little silly then that despite how big of an impact this game had on me, that I never really meaningfully returned to it. It is super rare for even games that I really like to become games that I play over and over again, but instead, what 2016 did for me was unearth a whole new world of possibilities in the FPS genre that I was eager to explore. And so that is what I did instead. But now 4 years on, right at the cusp of a new Doom entry, feels like as good a time as any to return to Doom 2016, where it all began, with all of the single player, old school, indie, and boomer shooter knowledge and experience I have now, and really reappraise this initial reboot of the iconic franchise. Now, when you compare this game to Doom Eternal, it's easy to blanket 2016 using terms like simpler, more humble, more casual. And without a doubt, some of that is true to varying extents. But often when people talk about the game in these absolutes, I do kind of wonder when the last time they replayed it was. Because I've seen an opinion that Eternal has basically completely superseded any need to play or revisit 2016. And I honestly think that people who genuinely believe this are doing themselves and others a disservice. Despite all of their similarities, Doom 2016 and Eternal are, to me, two very different interpretations of what Doom for a modern audience can be. And in my opinion, both approaches are extremely valuable and worthwhile, each with their own perspectives to offer. But for all the differences between these two titles, I actually found in this latest playthrough that 2016 laid a really solid foundation for a lot of the things that Eternal would go on to build on. Yes, your movement is slower and your traversal options are less complex, but 2016 introduces a really interesting verticality to Doom's combat, where your jump plays a very important role, with the ability to double jump and very strong air control often being the focus of how you will engage with enemies and arenas. After having played through all of the original Quake, I'm inclined to say this actually might be the best comparison point for 2016's combat loop, to the point where one could reasonably wonder if it was maybe at one point in its development actually concepted as a Quake game. Yes, weapon combos, synergies, and interactions are not at the forefront of absolutely every encounter like in Eternal, but they're far from non-existent, and instead of defining your every engagement, they're more just like interesting considerations. But I kind of like that. Combat could be considered quite a bit easier than in Eternal, sure, but I'd like to reframe that as being just less fickle. Instead of really feeling like you need to play that rock, paper, scissors game, the more complex interactions you can get into with alt fires and upgrades and weapon swapping and mastery and whatnot kind of just open you up to considering, how can I accomplish this thing faster or better or more efficiently and with less resources invested? And since the game doesn't so deliberately spell them out, you might actually miss them, but discovering these combos and whatnot feels pretty cool, which I think is an extremely underrated aspect of 2016 that gets tossed aside in many people's minds just because of how blatantly Doom Eternal doubled down on it. Now, it's not really my goal here to say that one game is better than the other, and as much as people will probably try and spin it or interpret it that way, frankly, my answer to the question of which I prefer changes all the time, because not only are they, in my opinion, really close to each other in quality, as much as infighting among fans of the games will lead you to believe otherwise, but I generally settle on each game just doing different things better. And often there's merit to the different ways each of them approach the various aspects that make up Doom. Now, one of Doom 2016's strongest aspects is how it sets the tone right away. There's about 30 seconds total between you clicking the new game button and having a gun in your hand and blasting a demon in the face. I don't know if it was imperative that 2016 really nail these first moments right for it to be a fantastic game, but few moments in all of gaming are seared into my brain as much as these first moments of Doom 2016. And I think the game is better off for having established itself and what it's about right away, wasting absolutely zero time doing it. This is also, however, your introduction to the game's borderline useless pistol. It's a real black mark on an otherwise stellar arsenal that you will unfortunately find in your hand right away to start the game. It's good enough to dispatch with a few basic zombies in the first room, but it becomes anywhere from unwieldy to unusable on just about anything tankier. Thankfully, you also get the combat shotgun like 90 seconds tops later. Like I said, I did this playthrough on Ultraviolence, which if you're not super familiar, is like Doom's hard difficulty, holding true through pretty much all of the games. It's a balanced but above normal challenge. There's also Nightmare and Ultra Nightmare for the real freaks out there, but I felt like Ultraviolence was a good baseline to evaluate these two games on. Now, my first playthrough of 2016 was on Hurt Me Plenty, which is more of like a normal difficulty. And frankly, even though I was not accustomed to this type of FPS at all, which is why I was reluctant to go much higher in difficulty at the time, I still pretty much breezed through it. It was very frictionless. Now, I don't think Doom 2016's goal was to be insanely difficult. I think if anything, it establishes early on that what it's trying to be instead is a power fantasy. So I don't know what level of difficulty I was really expecting out of Ultraviolence, but I actually found my first few hours to be more challenging than I was expecting. I think a lot of people would consider Doom Eternal to be the harder of the two games, at least when played on the equivalent difficulty, and I would generally agree. But I found these early hours of my return to 2016 were pretty much defined by the ways in which going back to 2016 is a pretty big adjustment from Eternal. I immediately missed the expanded movement options, and I even found myself fruitlessly doing combos from Eternal, even though they don't really do the same things in 2016. And did anyone else forget that falling off an arena just flat out kills you in this one? Because, give me the juice. The sauce, even. I'm gonna die. Oh, dude! I was trying to jump over, but then I guess you just get caught on the rail. Whoa, okay. Nope. All right, that's fine. All right. This time for sure. Got the haste. Dude, no, there's no way. It's such a big radius. But we'll see if that... There's no fucking way! I'm fucking losing my mind in this arena, bro. This isn't to say that it was all my weird phantom limb experience and well-documented fruitless struggles against gravity that surprised me. I actually just felt more challenged than I expected to by Ultraviolence, at least at first. Enemies hit hard and you can't always just tap a button to escape their attack, or rely on a quick kill combo to trivialize them, at least not before you start to unlock the game's arsenal. And I found this early stretch of the game defined by just a lack of options and having to get pretty creative with arena routing and strategizing and really maximizing getting glory kills rather than just dealing with your enemies by any means possible. I kind of like this though, because whereas Eternal's level of challenge is always kind of defined by your mastery of its rock, paper, scissors gameplay, I think there is actually something refreshing about this game just saying enemies are faster and they hit harder. Good luck. I do think this also revealed some weaknesses with the game's balancing though, since as I played, the difficulty of the playthrough peaked really early and then got gradually easier until by the end of the game, I was basically never dying unless I really decided to mess around. And believe me, I still did plenty of that. But I kind of like that you earned your power fantasy a little bit here. Like, breezing through these arenas still requires some mastery of the arsenal and the movement of the game. I think a competent player is probably going to get there in the end, at least on Ultraviolence and below. Given that even if you don't really explore much and seek out secrets, the game peppers you with weapon upgrades, some of which are pretty damn powerful. And of course, you also get this game's version of the BFG, which is basically just a skip arena button. I get what 2016 is going for here. I really do. but I find that the game's difficulty plateaus too early and just can't keep up with how powerful the player can get, and as a result, some really memorable content down the stretch of the game can end up just being frictionless and a little bit forgettable. Like, I could picture in my head some entire arenas from Terrace Nabad and Urdok from Doom Eternal because of how intensely I had to engage with them to get through them on my first playthrough. But in 2016, I don't really find this to be the case very often at all. Don't get me wrong, I had a blast playing through this game and have overwhelmingly positive feelings about the gameplay on offer here, but returning to the game on ultraviolence was at least a bit eye-opening, either as to how much I had improved as an FPS gamer, or what I think is equally culpable, that Doom 2016 just doesn't really have that level of challenge available, at least on its base difficulties. So, nightmare it is next time, I guess. I think while it's easy to just dismiss this as a negative of 2016 when compared to Eternal, I actually wouldn't go that far. It's true that my desire for greater and greater FPS challenges has led me to all sorts of crazy places, but I think a lot of people are probably totally fine with Doom just being a power fantasy. And it's a refreshing aspect of this game that I appreciate when I return to it because of how many games I play that aren't like that. I think someone who has never played a fast-paced FPS before, or maybe has never even played an FPS before at all, are way more likely to feel at home in Doom 2016 than Eternal. And I think that's a great thing. I would also push back on any notion that Doom 2016 doesn't have anything challenging or engaging to offer, even if it isn't as difficult and complex as its sequel often can be. I enjoyed the rune challenges, I like doing most of the weapon mastery challenges, and enjoy the ways these make you think differently about your approach, even if it maybe isn't always necessary to apply this in regular combat scenarios. And while the bosses in 2016 are far from stellar, this is one place I will go so far as to say they got it way more right here than in Eternal, where bosses are mostly either just regular enemy introductions or extremely misguided gimmicks. I think at least two of 2016's bosses, namely the Cyber Demon and the Hell Guard, are both mostly well thought out and pretty fun. The Cyber Demon is unfortunately really easy, despite being probably the best modern Doom boss. But I think the little game of jump rope you play with it is compelling both visually and gameplay-wise. And the Hellguard actually has a proto version of the Gladiator's gimmick, which we'll see in Eternal, where if you shoot it mid-attack, it actually will take more damage and stagger a little bit. And even though Eternal used ideas similar to this more often, like with the Marauder, for example, I feel like it could have been taken much farther to make some really compelling boss fights. The Hellguard does have an annoying regenerating shield that you basically just have to wait for it to go down to damage it, which does kind of really ruin the pace of this fight despite a fun rhythm of attacks otherwise. The second part of this fight where you juggle two Hellguards at once without the pesky shield this time is pretty fun though. I was actually pleasantly surprised how much I enjoyed at least these two boss fights and feel unequivocally like Eternals are a pretty big step back across the board. So I hope Dark Ages will represent a major return to form in this department. Unfortunately, Doom 2016's final boss, the Spider Mastermind, is still a bit of a letdown. It's not awful, but it's kind of just a bullet sponge with a few pretty unremarkable attacks that are certainly not more interesting or challenging than anything the Cyber Demon or Hellguards throw at you. The only thing really worthy of consideration is this electric floor attack where you have to climb up on these pillars, but then, wait, you also have to climb down when the pillars get electrified. Yeah, this is all pretty lame, but let's just say this isn't even close to the floor for modern Doom bosses, as Eternal would later prove, but it's still not great. On this most recent playthrough at least, I was excited to find that you can actually crouch this sweeping laser attack it does. It might straight up be the only time I deliberately crouched in the whole playthrough, on the final boss. Yeah. Ow. Are some of these attacks meant to be crouched? If so, that's fucking silly. But I feel like some of these are like that right there. I feel like that's maybe meant to be crouched. Like most of them can just be jumped, but oh, no. And see, yeah, dude, I think you're meant to crouch that. Dude! Wait, that's kind of cool, actually. I can't even lie. It's like the one place in the game that crouch is useful, but it's kind of sick. Did you forget that Doom 2016 even had a crouch? I basically did. I think this is actually emblematic of a lot of Doom 2016 and its design philosophy. Largely, it's hard to classify this game as anything other than a huge success, and holding it up against Eternal, which was designed with the hindsight of 2016, is, in my opinion, not super fair. But even despite that, to me, it is impressive how much they got right for a first pass at what Doom could be for a modern audience. And things that could be seen as issues with its design, like the crouch or the borderline useless pistol, actually do kind of end up being charming quirks of an otherwise pretty airtight experience. And I think for all the ways in which Doom Eternal can be compared to 2016, I really kind of wish we had at some point been able to see something more of like a second pass at what 2016 was bringing to the table. Maybe if the game just got some DLCs or something where some of this territory could have been further explored, that might have been pretty sweet. Something I do find satisfying and well considered out of the box in 2016 though, is the story and world presentation. Now this is another place where fans of 2016 and Eternal seem to really be at odds. And at risk of being a fence sitter, I think both games have something to offer. And this one versus the other mentality is really kind of missing the forest for the trees. All to say, I can definitely see why a lot of people prefer 2016's approach, since it's really simple, but just well done. In classic Doom fashion, you dip between bases and facilities on Mars and portals to hell. And all the while, you keep getting story beats fed by a small cast of memorable characters that will pretty concisely explain what your goals are, where you ought to be headed, and why. Like, listen, does Doom 2016 have the most amazing story of all time? No, but it's fucking Doom. As far as a game where all I really needed is an excuse to keep moving forward and blasting demons, I'd say they pretty much nailed it. I can't stress enough that I don't really feel like Doom even needs a narrative. I think a place where this series has really front to back excelled is with environmental storytelling. And don't get me wrong, that's great here too. But I just feel like as far as injecting an actual narrative into Doom, it was done really well here. I'm rarely ever left feeling like the game is bogged down with story, and by the time the game rolls credits, I don't feel like I missed anything or was left wanting more. Other than that, it kind of ends on a cliffhanger that is disappointingly resolved in Eternal. Another aspect of this game that gets hotly debated between it and Eternal is the art style and level design. It feels like everyone I talk to has strong positive or negative feelings about the differences between this game and Eternal in this department. Looking at 2016 as a reboot though, I think the right approach was taken here. Much like the story, keeping things simple and just moving you forward, giving you reasons to dip in and out of hell portals, the environments in this game feel like they really draw from and celebrate the history of Doom. Obviously, this game is so far advanced graphically from its 1993 counterpart that a ton of liberties had to be taken to adapt this style to a modern game, particularly the verticality of these levels. But I don't know. I kind of think that for all you can say about the visuals of this game, they've not only aged really well, but they also captured the environments of both the endless gray Martian mega facilities and the environments of hell in a way that feels like a really compelling modern reimagining of the classic game. I know it's a really tired platitude about remakes and reboots, but this kind of is really what your brain imagines Doom looking like back then in a lot of ways. Now this does have some negative knock-on effects as well. I find 2016's levels really kind of bleed together, whereas Doom Eternal's more colorful and expressive level design really makes each level stand out from one another and focuses on delivering memorable set pieces more than creating a super consistent vibe. It does lend itself better to these memorable moments sticking out more in your minds. I don't think that makes 2016's approach bad, however. I think you may not as easily remember individual moments and arenas and vistas like you would from Eternal, but you almost definitely remember what this game looked like. I'd go so far as to say that if you ask the average person to picture what Doom looks like, there's a very good chance the general aesthetic of 2016 is what comes to mind. And this debate over what is true to the original Doom between this and Eternal, whether the somewhat grittier interpretation of 2016 or the more colorful and gamey approach of Eternal is better, all feels so silly anyways when you consider that the original game in 1993 looked like this. Like, I know we're dealing with some pretty major technical limitations back in 1993, but there is just a ton of room for interpretation and filling in the blanks. And I think it's totally fair for the series to explore new territory after 30 years anyways. So to sum up my experience with Doom 2016 in 2025, I just say, above all, I had a lot of fun and that a return to where it all began felt very worthwhile and fulfilling. But based on some of the conversations I see online about this or that, I think a lot of people have an idea in their head of this game that doesn't really line up with reality. And I'd implore those of you specifically, if it's been a while, to return to this game. I think it's easy to look back at 2016 and say, oh, they should have done this or they should have done that. But hindsight is, of course, 2020. And this game succeeded where it was most important, in reintroducing Doom to a new generation. And as a result, it has had a profound impact on my life, and it is a powerful testament to how games can just be fun, first and foremost. I think perhaps most surprisingly of all, 2016 clocked in at right around 9 hours for me on this playthrough, but I didn't feel like I needed more. You can absolutely squeeze more out of this game, of course, even without touching any of the multiplayer components, but this is just such a surprisingly lean game. And in a time when hardly anyone was focusing on single-player FPS campaigns, for id Software to come out and drop a 10-hour-long heater is pretty bold. And it paid off too, since Doom 2016 is still one of the most essential plays of the past decade for any gamer. Ultimately, Doom Eternal tries a lot more stuff. It's also not a particularly long game, but it feels like a game a little more concerned with justifying its price tag. So Doom 2016 is really refreshing in that way, and I'm so serious. I think a 10-hour campaign that's just dense with fun and great moments is way more worth it than a bloated 40 hours. I am envisioning Dark Ages to be a bigger game, more like Eternal and probably even bigger, based on both its price tag as well as what's been shown so far. But I hope, even though nearly a decade has passed and a lot has changed, that id doesn't lose sight of the less is more approach that made 2016 so great as we move into the Dark Ages. Now, sometime between my first brush with Doom 2016 and now, I checked out the original Quake. Quake was another formative PC classic for a lot of people that just passed by me because, well, I was 1 year old when it came out. And unlike Doom, this franchise has not really received the modern love that Doom has in the form of a full-blown reboot. Not that there doesn't seem to be plenty of interest in that sort of thing, at least based on what I see in the circles I'm in online and in my comments. Quake is arguably more known for its multiplayer component than its single-player campaigns anyways, and the most recent game bearing the title has been the ill-fated multiplayer-only live service Quake Champions, which originally released in 2017. The game is pretty fun, don't get me wrong, but it hasn't exactly been lighting up the Steam charts for most of its life, so to call Champions a success would be stretching it. And honestly, this game's lack of ability to find a player base may be factoring into Microsoft and id Software's decision on whether or not a Quake single-player game is even worth the investment at all. Now, not that I agree. Don't shoot the messenger, I'd love to see it, but I'm just trying to read between the lines here. Leading up to the reveal of the Dark Ages, there was a lot of people that thought this incoming game might actually be a Quake game. Now, regardless of what it's called, this game bears undeniable similarities to Quake. Not just in the overall setting and aesthetic, but even some weapon designs that look like they could be lifted right out of the Quake universe. But unfortunately, for those waiting for some actual new Quake, you will just have to keep waiting. At least if nothing else, Night Dive has taken on the duty of remastering Quake 1 and 2 so far, the former of which is what I played a couple years ago. And in doing so, well, first of all, Quake fucking rocks. I realize I'm like the last person on Earth to realize this, but yeah, this game, especially with Night Dive's help, has aged amazingly. And it's still crazy fun to this day. Like, whatever your favorite modern indie FPS or boomer shooter is, it probably owes like half of its mechanics to Quake. And actually, I realized it plays eerily similar to something like Doom 2016. Now, don't get me wrong, Doom and Quake have always been inherently similar. Kindred spirits, even. At the time, Quake was this colossal quantum leap from Doom for just having a third dimension of movement and aiming. But as time has gone on, the lines between these two iconic id Software franchises has grown increasingly blurry, to the point where their aesthetics and settings are basically the only thing that really meaningfully differentiates them. And even then, But in my playthrough of the original Quake single-player campaign, I saw a lot that felt familiar to Doom 2016. To the point where it's hard to say it doesn't have almost as much of Quake's DNA as Doom's. What it carries directly from Doom is the aesthetic, the iconic enemies, and setting. But when it comes to how it plays, I found the original Quake to really feel similar in how your movement played with enemy attacks and arenas, how learning and using the right tool for the job felt much more important, at least compared to the original Dooms. Like, this little dance you do to kill the Shamblers felt eerily close to something that I would do in 2016 or Eternal. All to say, I just think it's really clear that id Software has been going to the Quake well for as long as they've been working on these new Doom games. And although the gameplay of Dark Ages looks to be gunning for something different again, its aesthetic has once again gotten even closer to Quake than before. One has to wonder, has Doom just completely cannibalized Quake at this point? I know there are a lot of Quake truthers out there who would be sad to learn this, I mean, myself included at this point. And I do think a modern Quake game could have something distinct to offer from Doom if they just committed to it. But I guess in a way, maybe it's nice to know that id is at least considering Quake when making these new Doom games, even if they don't directly bear the title. Now, I don't need to spend too much time on Quake. I think this is just your PSA if you've never played it like me a few years ago, or if it's been a while, that this thing has aged incredibly and is still super fun. And actually, I think does have more relevance to modern Doom than you might expect. In many ways, modern Doom is as much Quake as it is Doom when you consider just how much the palette of gameplay here has changed over time. And I think we're going to see even more of the DNA of Quake in Dark Ages. Now, naturally, the journey I went on through fast-paced, violent, crunchy, and bloody single-player first-person shooters following my first experience with Doom 2016 did eventually lead me to Doom Eternal in mid-2022, where I had my first brush with it. It won't surprise many people to know that my first experience with Eternal, fun as it was not necessarily as frictionless and cathartic as my experience with 2016. It doesn't mean I didn't like the game, however. I did. A lot, for the most part. But Doom Eternal's very specific design philosophies sort of invite much stronger reactions to its mechanics and components. And while I don't have an intense, burning love for every single thing that Doom Eternal has brought to the table, I think unequivocally that the way Doom Eternal is designed is a huge triumph. And if id Software's goal was to leave this lasting impression with the game and generate ongoing conversations about what a Doom game can be, what impacts the decisions and directions of this game may have on the franchise, and how a bold interpretation of what an FPS game even can be would impact the genre as a whole, then looking back 5 years on from this game, I think we could say, yeah, this game absolutely accomplished that and then some. And whether you love or hate this game, it is hard to deny it absolutely had what seems to be the intended impact here. Now, I do actually really like Doom Eternal personally. Don't get me wrong here. In my first playthrough on Ultraviolence back in 2022 was a ton of fun. But to me, the game is not perfect. And for every innovation on Doom 2016 here that hits just perfectly and almost feels like a phantom limb when you go back to its predecessor, to find it absent there, there's another thing that was done differently here that just kind of leaves me puzzled. All in all, I'd say the experience is about as good for me, but with higher highs and lower lows. And although there are things in Eternal that don't land for me, I overall respect the boldness of Doom Eternal as much as I respect the relative simplicity and straightforwardness of 2016. Now, I want to get this out of the way because I know criticizing Doom Eternal is like sacrilege to some people, and I want to establish that I do think it's really great, and I have a lot of fun with it every time I come back to it, but no game is perfect, let alone one that took so many risks with its design. And while ultimately these are just my opinions, and if you really love stuff like Eternal's platforming, story, the home base, or, God forbid, the Icon of Sin, then I'm happy for you. But my personal criticisms of this game do not come from a place of hatred, but rather admiration. I think the good things about Doom Eternal are so good that I will happily accept some of its warts. But as we look towards the Dark Ages, I think it's important to talk about all the aspects of Eternal. As a really bold take on what Doom can be, and in a way, a kind of logical endpoint of a design philosophy that is pretty clearly not being directly iterated on in the Dark Ages. And with that in mind, I think there is a ton here worth unpacking. So let's do it. Right off the bat, Eternal makes the right choice to start you off with the combat shotgun. Now, the regular shotgun with no alternate fires or upgrades is nothing to write home about here, but it spares you having to play with the pistol for very long, like in 2016. Now, other than this, I don't hate Doom Eternal's intro or anything, but unlike 2016, which gets you just right into the action right away, Eternal's intro kind of, how do I put this? Sort of feels like you're just playing 2016 again until the game decides to become Doom Eternal. I can appreciate that this game didn't want to overwhelm you by just giving you all the new stuff at once, but for me, the game doesn't really start, at least until you get the dash, which is like half an hour into the game. Doom Eternal's intro is, for me, remarkably less to the point than 2016, which it felt like had a lot more trust that the players would just get it. Like, it's Doom, right? There is kind of an interesting juxtaposition in general with Doom Eternal, where the game is overall more difficult and more complex than its predecessor in a way that feels like it was used as a base, kind of expecting that you played it, but it also comparatively trusts the player to get it, basically none at all. Throughout the first few hours, you will be bombarded with pop-ups, locked into tutorial segments, and forced to do whatever the game is teaching you before it will let you leave. Eternal has a lot of systems, and the game wants you to use them, but this, to me, is the bad kind of tutorial. I think the funniest thing is that Eternal, throughout its intro, tries to do the Doom 2016 where it just gets you right into the action. And yeah, there's plenty of moments in its first few hours where it does just let you play. But But it's almost comical that every time it feels like you're about to do something really cool for the first time, oops, there's a tutorial pop-up. It's almost like two totally different teams designed the gameplay and the tutorial without ever communicating with one another. Finally, though, the game does eventually say, all right, we think you know everything you need to know, tutorial over. But it pops up hours into the game. Like, there's some legitimately really tough content before this point. The moment Eternal says, okay, we trust you, feels so arbitrary too. Oh, and you bet your ass this isn't the end of the tutorial pop-ups either. No clue why this pop-up even exists at all. It literally just reminds you like, hey, use your mechanics we talked about, okay, bud? Wait a second. What's this? A tutorial pop-up on the video? It looks like you can't continue without doing what it says on the screen. So, I guess just click the button and we could just pick up right where we left off. I assume this is going to be an important mechanic to understand if you enjoy the video and want to see more. Alright, nice job. Anyways, where was I? Doom Eternal's bizarre shoehorned in tutorial doesn't prevent it from being a great game. Far from it, it's still fantastic, but I think it's still worth mentioning because it illustrates right from the rip that Doom Eternal is a much more prickly experience than 2016. I have to imagine they honestly just had trouble communicating all of what's going on in this game to players concisely and seamlessly. And while I don't really like it, I don't blame them for doing it this way. At least it's practically impossible to miss. It sort of just feels like a victim of triage. Like they made the gameplay loop first, made it great, super fun and challenging, and then turned around and said, now how do we communicate all this? And frankly, I expect Dark Ages to continue on like this. It's clear that while I understand how weapon swapping and alt fires and stuff like that work because I've played a ton of FPS games before, Doom Eternal, or Dark Ages at that, could still be someone's first ever FPS game. This isn't an excuse because the same was true of 2016, and I never felt like that game tutorializing things took me out of the experience. But it's all to say that I do still kind of get it. Especially coming back to this game, I could have turned off tutorials, but I didn't feel confident that I remembered absolutely everything, and there is a lot of information to retain in this game. I also kind of felt like getting the developer-intended experience was important for the purpose of this video, so I left them on. But this brush with the game, it was really apparent just how frequent and distracting they were to the point where I wished I would have just turned them off. Otherwise, Doom Eternal's first few hours kind of come and go without leaving much of an impression, positive or negative. I'd say the first great level is Cultist Base, since this is where you unlock the last few really core pieces of your arsenal, like the super shotgun with its meat hook, which is just so fun. It's crazy to think that when compared to the original Doom, where you can't even look vertically, let alone move vertically without some major assistance, that this is where Doom was at in 2020, where you can fling yourself around arenas in absurd and satisfying ways. I have no notes. The meat hook is an iconic addition to an already iconic weapon. And there's something to be said for just how well Doom Eternal took the classic suite of weapons and made meaningful additions to them that feel right at home in Doom. And I'll miss my meat hook in Dark Ages even if it wouldn't really make sense there. Now, actually getting the super shotgun was something that, while I had experienced it before, was still a surprise to me on this playthrough because, frankly, I just forgot it. No, of course you don't just stroll in, fight some enemies, and grab it. That would be way too simple and make way too much sense. You actually, puppet a Revenant, which you then use to clear the area around the super shotgun, and then with the Revenant, you grab the super shotgun and bring it back to Doom Guy, because why? I mean, it's at least mildly amusing playing as the Revenant. Not more so than just playing as Doom Guy, however. Not even close. But I don't know, there's just something about Doom Guy, the guy who can punch down walls, pry open doors with his bare hands, and so on, needing someone else to do his dirty work, that just kind of feels at odds with what this game is about, and just leaves this segment feeling awkward and unnecessary. Now, this is a great time to interject that you will notice that I haven't talked about the multiplayer and side game modes in either of these games, and that's because they're a patently different experience that is difficult to evaluate between entries, and they always kind of felt like an afterthought to Doom's single-player modes. And not to mention, Dark Ages won't even have one at all, so it's pointless to use this to speculate on what might be coming in that game. But in Doom Eternal, the existence of a playable Revenant in its campaign likely comes from this game's battle mode, which pits playable demons against slayers. I guess this segment is here to be like, hey, don't forget this exists. But then again, this seems to be a theme making a return in Dark Ages where you will pilot a dragon and a giant mech. I digress. It does bother me at least a little bit because, though brief, it does take you out of the bread and butter of Doom for what I'll describe politely as some random shit. But the Revenant segment is quick and not entirely unfun. Then you just carry the shotgun back to Doom Guy and you can finally test out the meat hook. Wait, tutorial pop up. This is why Doom Eternal is such an interesting game for me to talk about. On one hand, you have some of the most beautiful, fully realized imaginings of what Doom's mechanics can be at their best, like the Super Shotgun's meat hook. Mwah! And then on the other hand, you have weird, shoehorned in, and sometimes poorly thought out elements sprinkled pretty consistently all throughout an experience that is otherwise pretty visionary. You get what I mean now by prickly? I do really love Doom Eternal though, but at times in this segment, it's probably going to sound like I don't, because it also just has these asterisks all over it that I feel like are hard not to address when talking about even the stuff that I do love about this game. Where 2016 is this consistently very solid experience throughout that just doesn't ever quite reach the level of amazing, Doom Eternal has these like amazing elements and moments, but it also just has so much more stuff than 2016. And where some of it lands perfectly, some of it just doesn't at all. But before I get into more of that stuff, I do really want to talk about what I love about this game for a minute though. Because I think the things Doom Eternal does well, it does really well. And so well, in fact, that it very much does offset all those little nitpicks that I have to make this a great game. The biggest of which is the combat. I mean, what else do you come to Doom for? I think there's no wrong answers to this question, of course. But if you polled a random selection of Doom fans, I imagine combat would be within the top 3 things mentioned by 99% of players. And some people might really like Eternal's platforming, or maybe they really care about art style, and for them, Eternal just doesn't quite look like Doom. But at the end of the day, for most people, that is not what you care about most. It is the combat. And nothing that I don't like about Eternal is even close to bad enough that it offsets an overall incredible combat loop. Doom Eternal's combat has not completely escaped criticism either, though, with a lot of people both lovingly and disparagingly calling it rock, paper, scissors. And I think this is actually pretty astute, but I at least personally don't see it as a bad thing. Doom's combat has honestly always pretty heavily involved cycling between different weapons to find the right tool for the right job and responding to enemy attacks with your movement. It is true that Eternal's combat is a very extreme interpretation of these aspects of Doom. But this idea that highly emphasizing learning and mastering specific counters and combos to deal with enemies has no place in Doom feels kind of revisionist to me. Much like in Doom 2016, you can also just blast your enemies with whatever in Eternal, but it doesn't necessarily always produce great results. Again, I'm playing on Ultraviolence, which is like Doom's hard difficulty for the most part, but perhaps a better interpretation when it comes to Eternal is that Ultraviolence is the difficulty where these weapon combos and synergies begin to become a necessary way to engage with the game. Each enemy in Eternal has one or sometimes several things that will deal increased damage to them, stun them quicker, or just in general make dealing with them easier somehow. Usually, it's the use of a specific weapon's alternate fire or equipment that will produce the best results. Sometimes you'll get an tutorial pop-up about it, or otherwise you can just look it up in the codex. I stressed this a bit in the 2016 segment, but this is not even a particularly brand new thing in Eternal. 2016 was a lot less deliberate about it, but I did find myself all throughout my most recent playthrough of that game using different weapons and equipment combos to trivialize some enemies there as well. I have to imagine that while maybe these things weren't specifically designed to be so integral to 2016, and were more just meant to be fun little things for players to explore and push their gameplay further, it seems obvious that id really liked this aspect of 2016 and decided to really feature it here in Eternal. I will push back though on anyone who claims this heavy showcasing of weapon swapping and combos in Eternal came out of absolutely nowhere. It is very clear to me that this was always intended in the previous entry to be a way to play the game, maybe just not the only way. But regardless, your personal opinion on Doom Eternal probably lives and dies by how much you enjoy this particular playstyle. Me personally, I do really like it, and it greatly enhances the game for me. At least on higher difficulties, while like I said, you can still blast enemies down using whatever you have in your hand, and sometimes you probably will since resource management is also a major element of Doom Eternal, enemies are generally faster and hit harder than ever before. And if you leave them alive too long, you can get overwhelmed and die faster than in 2016 by comparison. More so than always using the correct combo or weapon or whatever, to me, Eternal is actually about this resource management. Because you can't even begin to do this little weapon swapping dance if you don't have the ammo and resources to support it. Or if you're low on health and armor and a Hell Knight is about to slam you into a wall. And I actually maybe enjoy this part the most. Because you have to kill an enemy in the right way to get them to drop health, armor, and ammo. For example, if you tag an enemy with the Flame Belch, they spew out armor. Glory kills and blood punches can make them drop health. and the chainsaw makes them spew out ammo like a piñata. And using the right strategies often to keep your resources topped off can be really satisfying. Like hitting the jackpot on a slot machine level satisfying. My only one thing, and I already know I'm probably going to get hate comments about this, is that Doom Eternal's approach to resource management does make me wonder what place ammo pickups really have in Doom anymore. Now, before you start typing, just hear me out. I'm not saying that ammo should or even could just be removed from Eternal, but much like weapon durability kind of got phased out of Dark Souls by the games just making it easier and easier to repair your weapon until it was so easy you could just basically forget the feature was in the game at all, and then Elden Ring eventually just did away with it entirely. Doom Eternal's approach to ammo management feels like it exists somewhere on a timeline of ammo just being done away with in Doom entirely. Gone are the days where you essentially ever have to worry about hunting down ammo. The game will give you ammo on the ground sometimes, but there's not too much of a reason for it. If you're low on ammo, 9 times out of 10, you'll just rip the chainsaw on an enemy and basically everything will be completely topped off. Now, in terms of how the flow of using up your resources and then eventually having to find an enemy to chainsaw for more ammo works, you couldn't actually remove ammo from Doom Eternal completely, since this is intricately important to the loop. But given that your access to basically a full supply of ammo relies only on the cooldown of your chainsaw, and access to an enemy ready to accept it to the face, I almost wonder what a Doom Eternal with individual weapon cooldowns rather than finite ammo would look like. How different would that game really be? Could it actually maybe even be a little better? I digress. My only complaint here is just that given the game often asks you to use a specific weapon on a specific enemy, it's not at all uncommon that you will just run out of ammo for said weapon and find yourself immediately needing a refill, and instead of continuing to engage with the satisfying combat, suddenly having to survive and wait for a pip of chainsaw fuel to be recharged. I find this is when combat is at its weakest. It's not fun to have to just kind of run away in a Doom game. Even when you have the fuel, sometimes you just end up scrambling around for an imp or a basic zombie to chainsaw. Often you won't have the fuel to deal with whatever enemy is actually giving you trouble, since the bigger baddies require multiple charges. This leads to a pretty hilarious scenario too, where since your ability to farm ammo relies on having fodder enemies around to chainsaw, they kind of just respawn endlessly. And it's not uncommon for me to be looking for that last enemy and just keep running into fodder instead. This is just a weird consequence of how Eternal chose to approach ammo management. It's not really a bad thing, but it's an oddity that's worth mentioning. In a lot of ways like this, Doom Eternal is a really gamey game, where mechanics take a drastic priority over any semblance of realism or logical consistency. When people call it cartoonish or whatever, I think this is kind of what they mean. So much of it has no basis in reality, like why does setting an enemy on fire cause them to drop armor? Why does chainsawing them cause them to drop ammo? This was established in 2016, but it's even sillier and gamier here. Now, I don't dislike this aspect of Eternal, far from it. I actually think it's totally fine that Doom has fully embraced just being a game. But I feel like it bears mentioning since it is a criticism a lot of people have when it comes to Eternal. I just can't hate it when the Cacodemon does this hilarious gulp and swallows a grenade, though. Oh, there is one. See ya. Gulp! Oh, gulp! Gulp me! I don't know about gulp me. I don't know. I don't know about gulp me. I will be retiring gulp me. It's wild to think that I've only really touched on maybe a third of the game at this point, but I do have one more thing that on this latest playthrough jumped out to me as being worth talking about, and that is the story. Doom Eternal is a direct sequel to 2016, which, while playing it, feels wild to think about, because everything that's going on in this game leads me to feeling like I missed an episode of a show where a ton of shit happens. And now there's a new plot line with new characters going on, and I have no idea who any of them are. Namely, the Doom guy, or Slayer, is just embroiled in some kind of insane holy war. Hell is now this developed civilization, and some godlike aliens are pulling all of the strings, and you just have to, like, accept it. There's new characters who are all not really properly introduced and sort of just act like they know the Doomslayer. In all of this, I don't find there to really be a narrative hook for Eternal that really gets me interested in what's going on here as elegantly as there's a friggin' portal to hell and we gotta close it does. I think a much greater understanding of what's going on in Eternal exists in its myriad of codex pages and audio logs that you can find throughout the world. And fair play, but like, dog, this is Doom. I didn't come here to sit and read or sit and listen to an audio log. At minimum, it would have been great if you could listen to the audio logs without standing basically right next to them for their entire duration. What a genuinely baffling choice that is. At least there's not that many of them, thank God. And to be fair, this was how 2016's Slayer Testaments worked too, but those were not sometimes vital to understanding what was going on. So frankly, I give them at least a slight pass, although to be fair, this same argument should be applied to them as well. As you play, you will learn more about what's going on in Hell and Earth and about the Makers and the Hell Cultists and whatnot, but I just never find it to be all very interesting or compelling. Story has never been a main driving factor for me enjoying a Doom game anyways, but since it's more overt here in Eternal, it's also harder to ignore. And frankly, I just don't care for it. What Eternal does really well in this department though is kind of what Doom has always been really good at, and that is the environmental design and storytelling. There is this sentiment that Eternal is like too colorful and saturated to really look like Doom, and that its abandonment of mostly taking place in metal facilities and the kind of typical craggy, rocky red depiction of Hell, like in 2016, makes it feel not like Doom. But I don't really understand how that could be the case, given that Doom, since the beginning, has been at least pretty colorful and saturated, and things like Hell Cities have always been a part of the level design vernacular. To that end, the level design in Doom Eternal feels like a perfectly viable modernization of ideas that have kind of always existed within Doom. And frankly, the design vernacular and color palettes in the various levels of this game lend incredibly well to some extremely memorable moments. Far more so than in 2016, each level in Eternal sticks out strongly in my mind, usually for good reasons too. On this playthrough, I felt like I could really appreciate Doom Eternal's levels better than before. Having a grasp on the mechanics, I didn't feel like I was constantly fighting for my life, and felt a little more empowered to explore and do side content and such. So levels like the Super Gore Nest especially really stuck out to me on this playthrough. The design of this level is just awesome. Not only visually with this decaying city wrapped in hellish alien tentacles, but also design-wise, where a key hunt will loop you through its environments and back to its main hub multiple different times as you unlock secrets and side paths each time. To me, this is a much more effective and fully realized version of something like Doom 2016's Foundry, and is a great example of how the level design has really been pushed to the next level here. And on this playthrough, I had a blast unlocking every single one of these paths and tracking down as many secrets as I could. This is easily one of Doom's best ever levels. I felt similarly positive about the Arc Complex, albeit for different reasons. Arc Complex is really just a series of really good and tough arenas. I find at about this midway point of the game is when the combat really begins to peak. You have most of the weapons you will get in the playthrough, but limited enough resources that it can still be quite challenging. And I believe Arc Complex did a wonderful job of dancing around that balance throughout its length. Fortunately for you and me though, I don't actually have a lot to say about each and every one of Eternal's levels, other than that I really like most of them. So I'll spare you a recapping of just stuff that happens in this game. I kind of hate when videos do that myself anyways, but there is still plenty that I haven't talked about yet. Doom Eternal is, like I've already touched on, a game just chock full of stuff in general. And specifically, there is way more stuff than I even can talk about, but most of it has no bearing on my enjoyment, positive or negative. Broadly though, I find this kind of disappointing personally because I've come to really admire how lean 2016 is as an experience, and I can't help but feel like Eternal would actually be a better game if it was just a celebration of an amazing and unique combat system, instead of a game that feels burdened by an obligation to just have more stuff. One of those things, and perhaps the best illustration of this in my mind, is the home base, the Fortress of Doom. You come back here between levels and you can unlock some upgrades, practice your skills, and just admire the collectibles you found throughout the levels. This just does nothing for me personally but upset the pace of the game, and I'm endlessly puzzled why the things that you can do and unlock here couldn't have just been scattered into the game's levels and other upgrade systems, or in the event of the practice arenas, just like access through the main menu. Navigating this base is a pain in the ass too, considering how little of interest there really is to do here. The things you can unlock are mostly all behind doors that you must use Sentinel batteries, another item that you can find scattered throughout the levels, to unlock. And then the rooms they're in take up so much space that out of necessity they have to be scattered all throughout the base, which is just needlessly large as a result. This unlock progression, of course, coming in addition to weapon upgrade points, Praetor tokens, and runes, all returning from 2016's generally more simple upgrade system, but also now with the addition of Sentinel crystals, which are new and different from the Sentinel batteries. All of this starts to feel like, I don't know, like a battle pass or something. Obviously, you don't pay any money for this other than just the price you paid for the game, but something about this just feels kind of wrong for Doom. It's hard to pinpoint just why it feels like a step too far, since 2016 also had a good amount of these things. But there, they just kind of felt like fairly innocuous flavoring. For me, I think it's just because Eternal wants you to engage with it in such a specific way, but yet it also features this open-ended RPG-like progression system, which kind of feels at odds with its solvable puzzle-like combat. And it introduces all sorts of friction into unlocking the pieces you need to solve this puzzle. For, reasons? I don't know, man. My first thought was just that it feels like someone higher up at Bethesda looked at Doom Eternal and said it needed to feel more AAA than the relatively lean 2016, which in the late 10s and early 20s apparently just means skill trees and bloat. The real reason for it, though, is probably a knock-on effect of how ammo has been changed. In older Doom games, secret hunting was both fun and rewarding because it would usually give you sizable ammo caches and resources, sometimes even earlier access to weapons you'd normally only unlock later on, and searching and routing for these secrets could actually be a huge boon to you in your playthrough. In Eternal, though, basically all the resources you could need are at your fingertips, so instead, secrets have to be something else. I actually just love the experience of secret hunting, and I rarely care what's on the other end of it as long as I feel like getting there was fun. But it does seem like Eternal feels like it has to reward you for your trouble, and perhaps that is the reason for a real abundance of upgrade currencies. Often these rewards are intertwined with platforming puzzles, and I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about it. Platforming is probably one of Eternal's more polarizing elements, and it seems like everyone either loves it or hates it. Now, would I say I hate it? I probably wouldn't go that far, but it does feel like this weird compartmentalized aspect of the game that doesn't really feel like it uplifts the rest of the game. It just exists. This might be an unfair comparison, but when I really try and think of an example of this done well, my go-to is Titanfall 2, where you flow really freely from platforming and wall running into combat. Enemy encounters are designed around your pilot's really robust movement suite, and traversal often gives you cues as to the various ways you can use your environment to get around that also applies in combat. In Doom Eternal, though, outside of the monkey bars and arenas from time to time, platforming is just kind of a totally different side of the game that doesn't really overlap with combat much. Now, the same movement abilities that you will often use in combat get used in platforming, but just not really vice versa. Platforming is tied together by walls that you can grab onto and climb on that basically only appear in platforming segments. And this, for me, is where any chance the platforming had at feeling satisfying kind of falls apart. To indicate that you want to jump onto a wall, you have to press a button while right next to it to grab it, at which point you will do this pretty weighty animation indicating that you're now on that wall, and then you're kind of just stuck to it like glue. The better feeling option here is just dashing to the wall, which will produce the same result a little more seamlessly. But sometimes you're expected to expend your dashes before you get to a wall, at which point just grabbing it is the only option. And I don't know, something about this clunky grab is just what ruins any satisfaction I might get out of platforming. It basically eliminates any chance of it feeling flowy and instead makes it feel rigid. While you're climbing on walls too, since you never leave the first person, sometimes you'll need to look around, but as soon as you do, you stop being able to move. Just another clunky aspect of the platforming here. And the mechanics of platforming never really evolve past just seeking out the next platform or wall and just jumping to it. The game introduces more jump pads, dash resets, some new obstacles and stuff like that, but nothing that for me really ever builds up to anything very interesting or compelling. It's always just more platforming, never better or more interesting, which I guess can be a good thing if you already like what's on offer here, but for me, I've seen some arguments in favor of Eternal's platforming, even from people who find it decidedly mediocre like I do. A lot of these arguments end up being reduced to, but in 2016, and yeah, while 2016 does have a little platforming, and it's not that fun to just double jump between platforms and awkwardly clamber over obstacles, I would say that it was so infrequent that in my mind it wasn't really in need of an improvement, and I'd sooner have just removed it in Eternal, to be honest. But one of the more prominent arguments I see is that having some way of traversing large spaces was necessary for id to pull off the scale that they wanted with some of these levels. And yeah, it's kind of crazy to imagine a level like Urdok without these massive launcher segments, but I don't know, honestly. I think I'd push back on the idea that this was the only way to accomplish this, personally. Whether or not it was an admirable attempt is beside the point. Just to the point of whether it was necessary, like this space couldn't have been handled any differently, I'd probably disagree. In Turbo Overkill, an indie FPS game that has drawn a lot of comparisons to Doom Eternal, you will sometimes have to traverse large spaces in vehicle sections. Worth mentioning, this game also has platforming, and pretty good platforming at that. Platforming that I'd probably prefer to Eternal. It's just not the only way the game chooses to have you traverse these larger spaces. And honestly, I'll be a little brave here. I don't think there's anything wrong with space just being space. Now, 2016 doesn't feature levels nearly as large and ambitious as Eternal's, but it feels more content to just let you walk through the world without combat or gameplay happening to you. Have that time filled by Samuel or Vega dialogue or whatever. I actually think downtime and dead space in games, no pun intended, is important. Eternal instead kind of feels like it always needs to have a carrot on a stick jangling in front of you or you might get bored. I think Doom's relationship with space, and I mean literal physical space, not like the cosmos, is something I could write a whole video on. And it's something that it looks like will be approached in another decidedly different and interesting way in Dark Ages, which already looks to feature some of Doom's largest and most open world spaces ever. But in Eternal, something about them introducing these large spaces to traverse, only for them to be filled with kind of half-baked jump puzzles, I don't know, it just doesn't quite wow me. And the fact that I'm always doing something in this game actually might make it harder for me to just stop and take in these massive, impressive spaces like Urdok in a way that choosing to stand out on a ledge and just look out from an impressive vista would instead. It's another place where Eternal feels like it didn't really have faith the players would get it. Like the only way to engage with the world they've created for you is purely mechanical. And that there's no real benefit to giving players an opportunity to just take a breath or else they might get bored. It feels kind of cynical. Undeniably though, one way or another, these are some of the most impressive spaces, both visually and in scale, that have ever been put to a Doom game. Not that that's an incredibly high bar, but Eternal absolutely flies over it regardless. So while I don't love the platforming, I will accept some goofy monkey bar traversal puzzles along the way. I actually don't mind the way platforming has been integrated into finding secrets particularly, and I actually quite enjoy some of the punchbox puzzles. They've got a bit of like Zelda flair to them. Now, if Doom Eternal's platforming is meant to be a celebration of its expanded movement suite in its most favorable light, then what the hell is the point of this purple goo? This purple stuff locks you onto the floor where you can't jump, dash, or do really any of your fun movement abilities except walk forward. And every single segment it appears in within the game, which is luckily few, is among the game's worst. And I just struggle to see the point of it other than just a misguided attempt to be something different. I actually think there's a greater point I'm getting at here, which is that Doom Eternal is nearly always at its best when it's just being Doom Eternal. But there's so many head-scratching moments of just going, hey, look at what we can do. Isn't that neat? And like, no, most of it's not that neat. Give me back my jump, Hugo. Eternal has this really amazing and intricate kit of parts where everything, or most things, serve a purpose. And the satisfaction of the gameplay comes from using the right thing at the right time. As a result, you can imagine how much worse it feels when something is taken away from you that you had no real autonomy in. So with that in mind, I do want to talk about another contentious example of this within Doom Eternal, and that is the Marauder. Listen, there is hardly anything in all of gaming that people are more split on than the Marauder. So if you love it, I will not take that away from you. What I will say is that it can be very satisfying to juggle, respond to the moves of, and eventually do away with the Marauder. And I totally get that. But when I look at this greater kit of parts that makes up Doom Eternal, that's when I start to really have a hard time understanding the point of the Marauder. And listen, I want to preface this by saying that valid criticism of the Marauder is often reduced to a skill issue or a lack of understanding of how they're meant to work. And I do think that could be an element at play. I'll be the first to tell you that I don't consider myself to be exceptionally good at Doom Eternal. I'm passable at best, at least compared to how good you can be at this game. But here's what my fights with the Marauder usually look like these days. Hello, sir. Goodbye, sir. So, let's cut the bullshit a little bit. Whether you enjoy the Marauder or you don't, whether you find it ball-crushingly hard or you kill it with a one-cycle combo every single time, I think there are elements here worthy of discussion and criticism. On a high level, I think the Marauder has defined the conversation around this game in a way that has overshadowed a lot of great things about it. Because the Marauder actually is that boogeyman of how people tend to paint Eternal's combat in broad strokes. Do I think that Eternal's combat as a whole is way too rigid, requiring just one or two specific approaches to deal with every enemy, with no room for flexibility or expressive gameplay? No, I really don't. I think players interested in raising the skill ceiling will have a great time exploring that stuff, and casual players will probably be fine to learn to use this stuff as they see fit to deal with some enemies. And overall, I think Eternal mostly hits the right balance. And on Ultraviolence, at least, I was pleasantly surprised after some limit testing how many enemies I could take care of by just bursting them down with the chain gun or tapping them a few times with the ballista. But the Marauder actually kind of is that enemy that is so rigid and requires such a specific approach that it is, for me, not fun. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say with a straight face that there aren't multiple ways to deal with a Marauder. Instead, my issue is how much agency the Marauder takes away from you. When one enters the arena, you generally want to pay attention to it right away. So right off the bat, the Marauder has taken something from you, and that is target prioritization. There's almost no universe where it isn't immediately the most important thing to deal with, and this can be a real pain when it shows up with other, sometimes also difficult and demanding enemies. Secondly, if you were hoping that you could just deal damage to it, think again. It is a self-described defensive powerhouse, and the only real time to deal direct, unblocked damage to it is when you are able to hit it when its eyes glow green and stun it briefly. However, it only does this glowing green eye attack when you're at approximately medium range. I feel like this is misleadingly tutorialized because the way it is explained, it seems like what you need to do is stand in front of them and feel out this medium range. When in reality, they will very often just close the distance to you if you get too far and get themselves in medium range for the green flash attack. I don't think this largely changes anything though, because I don't really find just constantly backpedaling from the enemy very fun either, or really very at home in Modern Doom's self-described push-forward combat. Now yeah, you can still use your movement to respond to his attacks, but in general, the Marauder is going to define your movement and positioning as well. Now sure, then you can attack it with whatever you want to stun it at this range, at least when its eyes flash. But because the stun is so short, you really want to maximize the damage you can deal in this window, because this guy has a lot of health. Most people, as a result, will tend to prefer the super shotgun or the ballista for dealing big chunks of damage fast. There are at least a few other options for chipping him down, like explosive splash damage, but in my opinion, you're going to want to feel out this basic rhythm of responding to the Marauder before you even consider stepping outside the box at all, which can still be a pain if you're flying totally blind. And even when you do, the options are still, in my opinion, far more limited than for most other enemies. So last but not least, the Marauder also strongly dictates your weapon choice. And doing all of this correctly does make the Marauder pretty easy. But God forbid you try and step out of the box too much, these guys become painfully obnoxious. Also, always dependent on the size and shape of the arena they're in and what kind of enemies they're paired with. And to be honest, they're often put in scenarios that id had to have known they'd be really annoying and frustrating in. So when people talk about Doom Eternal's combat being rigid and rock, paper, scissors like, while I do understand where this sentiment comes from, I think most of the game is a lot more nuanced than that, and just calling it rock, paper, scissors is an oversimplification of a really interesting and great combat system. But just not the Marauder. And if someone came away from this game feeling like their enjoyment of it died at the hand of the Marauder, who am I to tell them they're wrong? And that enough people feel this way tells me that a mark was missed with the Marauder, and no amount of skill issue or just do it this way, bro, can combat that. See, if you're listening to this section thinking, well, I like the Marauder because I just do this combo or whatever, I think you're missing the point too. If you really feel like people's dislike of the Marauder as an enemy comes down to a lack of understanding, then fine. But I do feel like at least some of the onus is on the game here to adequately telegraph and prepare you for how you will respond to this enemy, which I personally feel like it does not, as evident by how many people still feel this way about it. Even many who do overall get Eternal's combat loop. People aren't going to be willing to even go there if the Marauder ruins their fun so much that they don't feel compelled to return to the game. Me personally, I lean at least slightly more indifferent. I did kind of hate it at first, but learning some ways to trivialize this enemy has made them less obnoxious. But I also don't really feel like they add more to my experience than they take away either. Probably their intention is to gently nudge the player into learning to utilize quick swapping, but this is kind of the first time in the game that you really even need to consider quick swapping, and there ain't nothing gentle about this. Since a lot of people think the Marauder is great and shouldn't be changed or reconsidered, I want to actually go that extra mile and explain how I personally would change them to keep what's good about them intact while making them just fit a little more flexibly into Eternal's combat. I think the biggest issue is how rigidly they demand to be engaged from a certain distance and with certain weapons. What I'm not saying is that they should be nerfed, or that they shouldn't be oppressive, or that they shouldn't challenge your mastery of certain mechanics. Hell, I wouldn't even mind them being more oppressive if they just had more ways to respond to them as well. So what I do instead is make them have a variety of interruptible attacks at different ranges. So you'd still have to read and respond to their moveset. Maybe at close range, shotguns can punish them, and at farther ranges, the precision bolt and ballista could be more interesting considerations. I'd keep their shield, but get rid of the dog. I feel like them blocking careless damage is already indication enough that you shouldn't just unload your magazine into them. And then finally, I just add more ways to interact with them. Like maybe the shield could be disabled using a certain weapon mod, like the microwave beam, for example. But then when it is disabled, the Marauder would instead enter a hyper-aggressive state where it would attack faster and more aggressively, but would no longer block damage. Adding just more wrinkles to how you can engage with it, and allowing your response to it to be more tailored to the current combat scenario, like many other enemies in the game are. I think had they been designed like this, they still demand that you consider what weapon you're using, what distance you're engaging from, and dodging and moving around their moveset. I even still think they could be really challenging. I just think they'd be more fun and less rigid and fit more cleanly into the greater context of Doom Eternal's combat. Anyways, Marauders are a great segue into one of the last things I want to discuss to wind down Doom Eternal's base game, and that is the bosses, which are more or less an agreed upon weaker aspect of the game. Now, a couple of the game's bosses are more or less just regular enemy introductions, like the Doom Hunters, which are a fun, tougher enemy that, again, require a specific approach to defeat. But unlike dealing with Marauders, still feel like they have some room for creative gameplay. It should say something that this regular enemy introduction actually lands as one of the better bosses in the game, as you first fight one Doom Hunter in a more enclosed space where you can get really familiar with fighting it, and then you get dropped into an arena where you fight two of them. I think the reason this works is because it really just feels like a normal arena, but with two bigger and more complex opponents that you chip away at, which is something Doom Eternal feels tuned to excel at. It stands to reason that in a game that kind of lives and dies by its tightly designed arena combat against regular enemies, that the mechanics are less well tuned to fighting bosses. And beyond the Doom Hunters, this becomes extremely apparent. The Marauder's initial introduction isn't quite a boss fight. It doesn't have a health bar, and it's not buffed in any way from the version that you will fight at other points throughout the game. But allowing you to fight one more or less in isolation, I think, is important to giving the player a chance against Marauders when they appear in other arenas down the stretch of the game. But to call this a boss would be pretty generous. It's more of a mini-boss, if anything. It has a cool introduction, and then it is pretty unmistakably just a regular enemy. Of course, the weird asterisk here is that fodder enemies have to endlessly respawn in case you need to top off ammo, which I've already talked about this happening in regular arenas, and I understand why it's a thing due to how the mechanics of the game work, but I kind of just find this very transparently clunky in boss fights, which are otherwise supposed to be mostly 1v1 encounters. The Marauders mechanics then do kind of get built upon in the Gladiator fight, which I think is Eternal's most admirable attempt at a boss fight, though that isn't exactly a high bar. And listen, I think the Gladiator is more or less a good fight, but I think its most disappointing aspect is that it feels like a first pass at a cool idea that could have and maybe should have been built upon further, and it just wasn't. At least not in the base game, and when it does get built upon further in the DLC, well, okay, we'll get to that. And I definitely had a higher opinion of the Gladiator coming into this playthrough too. It is good by comparison to Doom Eternal's other bosses, but it still suffers from a lot of the same problems that all of them do. Like the fact that this boss fight working at all is reliant on a constant trickle of enemy adds. Additionally, the flow of this fight is dictated by shooting the Gladiator when its eyes flash green, like the Marauder. This is a fun mechanic in a vacuum, and the first phase with the shield introduces it really well. But in the second phase, it starts to feel random. He cycles through just a few attacks, but you end up kind of just waiting for the green flash attacks. You can at least damage him normally now without waiting for him to drop the shield, but I don't know. I don't find this phase really as enjoyable in practice as it should be in concept, and engaging with the moveset in the way the game wants you to feels at least a little dependent on RNG. Dodging his attacks is just a little awkward too, since your dash does not have iframes. This playthrough to me revealed all kinds of janky hitboxes and strange behaviors in this boss, and at least one or two attacks are not very well telegraphed. Given that Dark Ages seems like it will have more enemies and possibly bosses like the Gladiator, I really do hope they can shore that stuff up. Conmaker is another interesting swing, but ultimately miss. At least this fight is pretty frictionless. Generally speaking, I'd rather a laughably easy bad boss than a difficult bad boss. The Conmaker is not terrible, at least. I think there's some creative ideas here that just didn't get taken nearly far enough. It kind of feels like the first phase of a fight that should have more phases, but instead it just has the first phase 5 times. To damage her, somewhat like the Doom Hunters, you have to chip down a shield. And then to advance her phase, you basically just meat hook grapple to her and punch her. All the while, she does attacks that are piss easy to dodge. She'll occasionally set the floor on fire, which maybe could be dangerous if it did like any damage. And you have a constant stream of resources due to the Maker drone ads. As a side note, I actually quite like the Maker drones. I think landing a headshot on them to make them pinata out resources is a little more fun and engaging than having to use the chainsaw every so often to do the same. All in all, the COD Maker feels like it has the ingredients to be at least a decent fight, but it fails at being anything more than just a speed bump, due to really any lack of difficulty or friction presented throughout, and despite having 5 health bars, the fight never really evolves past this either. But the real star of the shit show is the final boss, the Icon of Sin. Now listen, I'm not going to mince words here. I think this boss is really bad, and made even worse by being the final encounter of the game and the send-off to an otherwise fantastic game and combat system. A lot of games stumble at their boss fights, and I can see why it would be so difficult to get right, especially in a game like Doom Eternal where the mechanics are much more suited to the chaotic arena combat than boss encounters. But given that there are better boss fights in this game, that they still chose to do the Icon of Sin this way is bafflingly frustrating to me. To start, we first need to talk about the Crucible Sword, which is itself a pretty mediocre and half-baked mechanic. Of course, getting this thing is pretty cool and is the theme of the entire Terrace Nabad level, and the process of activating it is a cool little level set piece. And then you get a little arena to just slice apart enemies with it. But beyond this point, it is a bizarrely implemented mechanic to say the absolute least. Basically, when you have a charge of it, you can just slice an enemy to death, costing 1 charge. And honestly, despite how cool it looks, it just feels way clunkier than the chainsaw or the regular glory kill somehow. It's kind of remarkable how sauceless they made a giant laser sword feel here. I don't have a ton to say about it though, because at its best, it's just a neat little option that you will rarely consider that gets introduced too late to have a major impact, and it doesn't really fit into the game's combat as neatly as most other things do. It is, however, heavily featured in the final fight, albeit in just about the least cool way imaginable. See, the Icon of Sin is this big guy who stands off stage and has multiple parts that you must shoot off to advance the fight. He'll attack using slow, telegraphed, and easy to avoid moves periodically, but really the fight is an arena fight. So that's a good thing, you might say. Doom Eternal is good at those. If only it were that simple. Your main goal is to chip these armor parts off the icon, and doing this isn't so bad, but it does require a lot of ammo, and it can be a little tedious as the icon moves around a lot, so aiming shots to deal damage where you want can be a pain, and all the while, enemies will be spawning into the arena. Now, I could be wrong about this or not painting the full picture, but my understanding is that the enemy spawns, at least in this first phase, are pretty much completely random, with some limits. I mean, you won't see a Marauder spawn in, but beyond that, just about anything goes. This is not just a clunky oversight either. As I understand it, this was intended as a nod to the Doom 2 Icon of Sin, which has a similar enemy spawning mechanic. But let's not pretend Doom 2's Icon of Sin is some beloved staple of the franchise. It is largely hated. So why now, at the very end of the game, did id see fit for a nod to one of Doom 2's most panned encounters is beyond me. So despite having designed the fight this way deliberately, it seems the developers knew how overwhelming this could get, so they threw some respawning Crucible Sword pickups into the arena so you can just bypass Doom Eternal's purposefully nuanced combat and just do away with some annoying enemies. Dealing with the Icon of Sin itself is not exactly what I would call fun either, but it's really just a bullet sponge with various parts that you have to chip away at and eventually break. But with all of this to juggle, the fight can just drag on unfortunately long. Some BFG pickups around the arena will speed things up, but well, even so, I would have preferred a well-designed and engaging fight rather than one that was intended to be mostly bypassed with the BFG and Crucible Sword. The second phase of this fight is largely more of the same, but the arena is more open, which is welcome, and the spawns are less random. So, an improvement overall. The icon will also rotate around the arena, changing up your positioning a little bit. It's a decent little twist, but much of the same overall issues still apply here. It's long, not that fun, and the best strategies generally do not reflect Eternal's combat at its best. Nothing in this phase 2 is a big enough improvement to scrape this boss fight out of being shit tier. I just really hate it, and I think it was a remarkably misguided send-off to Doom Eternal's base game. For what it's worth, if you see something I'm not seeing in this fight that makes you enjoy it, I'm happy for you, but I don't too often see much praise for this fight. Fortunately, it should learn from this boss fight, and future boss fights should be an improvement, right? Well, there's still hope for Dark Ages, I guess. So with that, we wrap up the base game of Doom Eternal. And I gotta say, while the things that previously annoyed me in this game didn't really grow on me this playthrough, coming back to the game having a pretty decent grasp of the flow of combat, I did really thoroughly enjoy the arena combat throughout. In fact, Doom Eternal might quite literally represent this old school arena FPS combat at its absolute best ever. And I don't say that lightly. And while this really awesome core has all sorts of prickly edges that I'm less fond of, I do greatly respect Eternal's commitment to just trying shit. Doom is a storied and iconic franchise, and people have all sorts of ideas of what it should be, with very few people in outright agreement of what that core actually should be, so that in the 2020s, we're getting these bold takes on Doom, let alone ones that aren't really interested in catering to absolutely every type of player, is pretty cool. And even more broadly, rare for Western game developers. And while Dark Ages looks very different, yet again, it also looks like another bold take, and I'm happy to see it. Now, like I said at the top of the video, I have never played Doom Eternal's 2 Ancient Gods DLCs. So this was actually a great opportunity for me to check out what is currently Doom's newest content. And although my first inclination was that maybe it would give me an idea of where things could be headed in the Dark Ages, after playing the DLCs and seeing a little more of Dark Ages, I think it's safer to say that these DLCs are more of an extreme interpretation of Doom Eternal's ideas and combat, and that Dark Ages will likely once again be shifting to something a bit different. That doesn't mean there's nothing of value here to dissect, though. There is definitely broadly some ideas here that may have inspired some elements of Dark Ages, and if nothing else, the Ancient Gods gives Doom Eternal a chance to address and rework some ideas from the base game that didn't quite land. But does it? Well, safe to say, like myself, many people's opinions on Doom Eternal are kind of resting on a knife's edge. There's a lot of things I love, but the game also just has and tries so many things that it's nearly impossible to please every single person with every single one of these choices made here. And despite really liking Doom Eternal and thinking it's fantastic, this video has been a lot of critiques and analysis of some of the, in my opinion, bizarre decisions that it made as well. But I think Doom Eternal is actually pretty content accepting this slightly controversial status. And as a result, some people absolutely love it, and some people absolutely loathe it. So if you come into the DLCs hoping that they've got more of that one thing that you really liked and less of that one thing that you didn't, only to find that it has almost none of that thing you liked and way more of that thing you didn't, yeah. All to say, I can see how this could happen. But despite having been primed that the DLCs are aggressively and unashamedly more Doom Eternal, warts and all, I was ready to go in with an open mind. And I'm glad I did, because part 1 opens up with a level that I would consider to be Doom Eternal at maybe its absolute best. Given that it picks up where the base game left off, you basically get to just use everything in your arsenal against some of the game's toughest arenas yet, and just test your mettle. And I do mean everything in the arsenal. It's kind of funny because in the base game, you have to specifically go and unlock all of the weapon mods and masteries, but then in the DLC, you kind of just get them, which I can totally understand. The Ancient Gods definitely has a vision of being Doom Eternal's combat at its absolute pinnacle with its most difficult encounters ever, and I imagine just giving you everything allowed them to really go all out in this department. And it's hard to dispute that based on what we got. But it does also make me wonder, what purpose did having a progression system in a combat loop as tight as Eternal's even really serve? I mean, I enjoy unlocking secrets and doing the weapon mastery challenges intrinsically, but the DLC's nonchalance about just doing away with unlocking things, well, except for one thing that I'll mention later, makes me wonder if Eternal's base game is actually a little bogged down by being unable to account for different people ending the game at different power levels, somewhat needlessly. It's a complex issue that I don't think I really have a straight answer to because, honestly, I can't lie, I do like unlocking things. But the DLC, of course, still has trinkets and cosmetics to find if you do enjoy that act of secret hunting, and it didn't necessarily need a full-blown progression system to still have this. I digress. The result, either way, is that the Ancient Gods Part 1 opens up with one of Doom Eternal's best levels, the Atlantica facility. I don't actually have a ton to say about it, other than that it absolutely rocks. The combat here is challenging, A real palpable step up from the base game and just super fun. This level also adds these turret enemies that only stay open for so long, and when you look at them for too long, they will close and not be susceptible to damage. Your options are basically to focus fire only when they're open, or to use combos that deal burst damage fast enough during their open window. This is a simple enemy, but one that I found pretty engaging, and I liked that simple combos had a real place in fighting them efficiently. I think quick swap combos are often not something that the game does a good enough job at encouraging, personally. Now, otherwise, this level is light on new stuff, but it's just a real solid level with lots of good arenas. I didn't love the extended underwater segment because swimming in this game is not really great, and this level might be a real challenge for you if you haven't gotten the hang of fighting marauders yet, since it really has a ton of them. I still don't personally enjoy them, and the DLCs didn't really change my mind, but even the duo fight here didn't give me a ton of trouble on this playthrough. So all in all, we're starting off pretty great. The Blood Swamps is where things get a little more mixed for me. This is where the Ancient Gods become something more than just more and better Doom Eternal. Really looking to shake up the game's combat rather than just offering a refined version of the base game. If you enjoyed the more open level structure of something like Super Gore Nest, this is more like that. And the level structure and visuals are all great. It's more the mechanical and enemy additions here that I'm a bit mixed on. See, a lot of the Ancient Gods feels how I can only describe as being cynically designed. I don't even necessarily mean that in an outright bad way, because it actually does produce some cool ideas, but it feels like a lot of the DLC's additions and omissions were less things that id Software did thinking players would have fun with them, and more things that they thought might just fuck with players. Or put more favorably, not so gently force them into playing a certain way. The Spirit is a prime example of this. The Spirit is a demon that possesses and empowers another demon, making them faster, their weak points indestructible, and giving them immunity to staggers until the host demon's health is fully depleted. Now, I should mention that this is similar to a base game mechanic that I failed to touch on in the previous section because, well, it has no real bearing on my enjoyment of the game whatsoever because it is such a nothing burger, and that is the buff totem. The buff totem is a thing that exists in an arena and empowers demons, making them faster and more aggressive. The enemies glow red, so it's very obvious when there's one nearby, and all you have to do is locate the totem and just punch it once, and then play the arena normally. There are a few times when the totem has a prerequisite to unlock it, but rarely does it cause too many issues. And that's it. I really struggle to see the point of buff totems as they're employed in the base game. Should you try fighting buffed enemies, you'll realize very quickly that it's pretty annoying and messes with your muscle memory, but there's never really any point to doing so because you can also just go find the totem and punch it before engaging with the single enemy like 9 times out of 10. Now, I wish that I could say buff totems were used more interestingly in the DLC, but nope. They're kind of just spammed, used a lot more indiscriminately, and rarely in a way that ever made me go, huh, that's interesting. Except for, I guess, the one time there's a buffed marauder, but I'll let you guess how fun that is to deal with. So the Spirit feels instead like a way to just force you to engage with buffed enemies. Now, spirited enemies, like I said, are a little different from buffed enemies, but only in ways that, in my opinion, just make the mechanic worse. Namely, adding the inability to stagger or destroy weak points really takes every fight with a spirited enemy out of the realm of Doom Eternal's fun and nuanced combat, and turns every enemy it possesses into just shoot it until it dies. When the Spirit does pop out, you can lock it in place and ultimately kill it with specifically the plasma rifle's microwave beam, which can only be a direct response to this firing mode's general unpopularity in the base game, at least as I understand it. Now, I do have to admit that dancing around the Spirit as you zap them can be pretty fun, actually, but it's all good I can really say about this enemy, since otherwise I find them pretty unfun, and I find the necessity of using the microwave beam on them to be pretty cynical and ham-fisted from a design perspective. It did prompt me to see the microwave beam in a bit of a different light though, and I ended up using it at least a little bit more throughout the DLC. So I guess in a way it was successful, but still, couldn't this have been better achieved by actually making the weapon mod itself more enticing than just outright forcing you to use it in one specific instance? The actual mechanics of spirited enemies are what I have a larger problem with than the actual spirit enemy itself, which doesn't do a whole lot once exorcised from the demon it's inhabiting, as long as you can get to it and zap it fast enough, which you usually can. Another example of this, though, is the spectral whiplashes. I can't see a reason for these to exist other than just specifically to make the popular strategy of using the rocket's lock-on burst for dealing with this already rather annoying enemy just straight up unviable. This is another example of what I would call cynical design present in the DLCs. I think responsive design is okay, but I just can't see stuff like this as anything other than, oh, players are using this thing? Let's just take it away from them. They'll love that. The Blood Swamps is, in general, a level full of set pieces, where your progression through it is defined by the game putting you in uncomfortable and uniquely designed combat scenarios. For example, this segment where you follow this dog through a poison swamp that has a bubble around it protecting you that you kind of need to stay inside of as you fight through waves of enemies. There's arenas filled with fog that make it hard to see and lock onto your enemies, and just in general, the level is filled with arena gimmicks that range from pretty cool to pretty annoying. The level caps off with 2 separate paths that you have to go down in whatever order you please, each culminating with a really insane and difficult arena. I found these end arenas to be really tough and enjoyable overall, but some of the other experiments along the way didn't land as well. Again though, this is just so Doom Eternal. Not content to rest on their laurels in the DLC, continuing to push and test the limits of Eternal's combat in new ways, even ones that don't always land. This level culminates with a mini-boss, and honestly, is it weird to say that this is one of the most interesting boss encounters in Doom Eternal? I've already touched on what I think Doom Eternal's bosses are lacking and where I think they shine, or at least could shine. And this actually hits a lot of the notes, weirdly. Now, I think the trouble here in stacking this up against the game's other bosses is that this isn't really a boss. All you do here is shoot the eye inside this cube until it falls to the ground, and then you can punch it into the shield. But I don't know, I just like this a lot, no matter what you want to call it. It once again feels like an arena fight with a secondary goal more so than a boss fight, but this is kinda what Eternal does best and feels most tuned to excel at. Not to mention using the box punching mechanic in an interesting way as well. I'm a fan of that. The final level of part 1 is the Holt. And there's a lot that I like here, but once again, plenty of stuff I don't love as much. First of all, returning to Urdok is just great. It's the most visually striking environment in probably any Doom game up to this point, so seeing it again in a different light is of course really cool. Seeing some of the mechanics and enemies expanded on here as well is really welcome. The Bloodmaker gets introduced here and is probably the best enemy addition in this DLC. It's basically a supercharged Maker drone, which I've already talked about enjoying them as more engaging fodder enemies. Now, the Bloodmaker is shielded from damage by default, but it will occasionally do big telegraphed attacks, leaving it vulnerable for a headshot, which will swiftly do away with it, much like a Maker drone. It is possible to view this as being as rigid as something like the Marauders, but I don't really see it that way personally. In fact, I see this as a glimpse at how Marauders could have been iterated on in a different world. Now, Bloodmakers are much easier to deal with than Marauders, but just in general, the idea of how paying attention to a pretty powerful enemy and responding to them at the right time with the right strategy can actually be incredibly engaging without being completely oppressive. Overall, though, I found the arenas and difficulty in this level to be approaching the limits of fun within Doom Eternal's combat. Usually landing on the correct side of that line, mind you, but frequently I found enemy combinations to be pretty oppressive, arenas to be just slightly awkward to navigate, and just one too many overlapping gimmicks at times, sometimes eroding my fun. I am glad they explored this territory, but I'm going to be realistic and say that the level of challenge present here was not always my cup of tea. Special shout out to the Slayer Gate in this level, which is the only arena in either of these games that I straight up noped out of, since it featured an extremely janky, spirited Marauder that I just could not be fucked to deal with. And that is a first across Eternal and 2016 that I actually backed down from a challenge. At least this doesn't unlock anything too important. Slayer Gates in this DLC just unlock something called support runes, which are separate runes that go in their own slot specifically for the DLCs. I only found one of these to be very useful personally, and you can only have one equipped at a time anyways. So yeah, all to say this gate had nothing to offer me that I felt too bad about passing up on. The final boss here in this DLC is something people seem pretty split on. I think I overall liked it, but it fell into a lot of the same pitfalls as Eternal's base game bosses, so I can't exactly commend it for breaking the mold here either. Namely, the actual fight here is piss easy, and any semblance of difficulty is completely defined by arena gimmicks. This is Samurai Maker, the true evolved form of Samuel Hayden. I don't have a ton to say about the story here in the DLCs because, simply put, it kind of just picks up exploring aspects of the base game that didn't really click with me. But I do like at least that we finally get a real continuation and conclusion of Samuel's story, since his involvement in the base game is disappointing to say the least. In a lot of ways, part 1 of the Ancient Gods actually is Samuel's story more than the Doomslayers. but it's overall just okay in its execution. But once again, it feels like it kind of picks up at a point where we missed an episode and too much of this exposition and plot is delivered and spearheaded by a character only known as Intern. Yeah, I don't know, man. At least it's not so much buried in codex pages and audio logs this time. But seeing as Dark Ages looks to again have more characters, more story set pieces, and more dialogue, I feel like it's not a huge ask for the game to also feature generally better character writing and exposition. We can only hope. Anyways, the actual fight with Samurai Maker is extremely easy. You just dodge some telegraphed and slow-moving projectiles, track him as he teleports around, and just chip him down. The real bulk of the fight is actually spent dealing with this shield gimmick. Samurai will spawn 2 spirited enemies, and you have to kill the spirits to break his shield. This will happen twice before the fight is over, and I don't know, man. I didn't like totally hate this segment, but I did already express that I don't love the spirited enemies, and having them occupy such a large bulk of this fight, both in terms of time and tedium, and define its challenge so much, feels at least a little disappointing. Even if the execution is overall solid, not to mention after the second time you break the shield, the fight just ends. It's real anticlimactic. At least this fight overall averages out to being okay though. When it began, I had some hope that this was just a regular 1v1 fight that would evolve over its phases, so I ended up a little disappointed by how it played out. But it's not terrible, and the bar is low enough that this definitely ranks among the better fights in this game. That about does it for part 1 though. I overall really enjoyed it despite some additions and encounters not landing for me. I think what impresses me most though is just how all out they went with the challenge level without it usually feeling too insane. It has those moments where it crosses the line, but all in all, it's mostly well applied and does have some well thought out changes and additions. And the first level of this DLC may well represent Eternal's arena combat at its absolute best, when it just cuts you loose with everything at your disposal before introducing too much stuff on top of that. I can't say I fully understand the mixed reviews for this one, since it's great in a lot of ways the base game is great, and prickly in a lot of the same ways the base game is prickly. But as this DLC still costs $20 full price in 2025, I'd say maybe that's just it. I beat this in about 5 hours, and while I'd returned to play the levels, I guess, there isn't really much else added. No new weapons or anything else to chew on. And if you took a big break from the game and found the difficulty overwhelming or hoped this DLC would deliver more to chew on, yeah, I suppose I can understand being disappointed. Well, on to part 2, which is not known for being controversial at all. Now, part 2 picks up right where part 1 left off. Like, literally right where it left off. I mean, here we are, standing in front of a naked guy. Story-wise, this just tees us up for the final confrontation with this character known as the Dark Lord. I actually do appreciate how generally light on story exposition part 2 is. I mean, part 1 got most of it out of the way, so cutscenes and set pieces here are mostly just vibes and hype moments. In a good way. Like, I genuinely feel like that is when Doom is at its best. And the first level here, the World Spear, is once again one of my favorite levels in the game. And it makes some additions that actually feel really inspired, as well as some that I'm a little more mixed on. But overall, I think weirdly the first levels of each of these DLCs really hit a sweet spot between a little bit of new stuff, but mostly cutting loose with Eternal's existing mechanics. And this time we already also have a whole DLC worth of stuff to build on, and it's mostly well served in this level. Things like Bloodmakers and Spirits feel a little better when they appear just now and then instead of in like every arena. Right off the bat, the Ancient Gods 2 actually does something that I never thought I would see, and that is they fixed platforming. Okay, well, maybe not fixed, but improved? Absolutely. The introduction of grapple points are a really inspired and welcomed addition to platforming that finally spices up one of the game's more stagnant aspects for me. I do think that grapple points could have been introduced into the game a lot sooner, to a massive benefit to how much I would have enjoyed platforming here. Like, maybe the idea was there, but they just didn't quite get it fully ready for release. Either way, for me, this made platforming way more fun to engage with in this DLC. And also, these grapple points are used in combat arenas as well, which addresses another complaint I had about platforming elements. In the same way you might grapple to an enemy to reposition, these will always be available to give you a nice little fling across the arena. And it is actually quite important in this level, since you get some huge arenas packed full of enemies that can get really overwhelming, and sometimes you just need a breather and a fresh perspective that only flying over all of your enemies' heads can provide. Pretty quickly here, we're introduced to the Armored Baron as well. The Armored Baron is once again a pretty rock, paper, scissors type enemy, where damaging him properly requires engaging with a gimmick. And much like the Bloodmaker, I find it significantly more compelling than the Marauder. Not only because there's multiple ways around it, but because it doesn't so drastically lock you into combat with it, specifically like the Marauder does. But like the Marauder, the Armored Baron has this flash attack with its mace, and hitting it during this will remove its armor and leave it vulnerable to damage for a period of time. It's hard to go in much more depth about this DLC's additions without first talking about its biggest addition, which you receive at about the midway point of this level, and that is the Sentinel Hammer. The Sentinel Hammer essentially is an outright replacement for the Crucible Sword, which was notably entirely missing in Part 1. And as far as just having a point, unlike the Crucible, which was basically just a button you could occasionally use to skip an enemy you didn't want to fight with little other utility, the Sentinel Hammer really rights some wrongs here by being way more useful and way more intricately important to the flow of combat. In fact, it may just be too useful and too intertwined with too many of the game's mechanics that your experience of the DLC is basically from here on out going to be defined by how you engage with the hammer. But I overall really like it. I even liked it enough that my overwhelming feeling after wrapping up this DLC was that I wish more of the game had been designed with it in mind. Basically, the hammer attacks with a big jump up and then a slam to the ground. And in a sizable area around you, it will stun enemies, it will cause them to spit out ammo, and should they be frozen or on fire, cause them to spit out extra health or armor as well. Doing this right, while it's not quite as effective at clearing a full arena as just spitting out a BFG round is, it can not only clear out or stun groups of problematic enemies, but it can also top off basically all of your resources. It immediately becomes one of the most powerful and important considerations in your arsenal as a result. Now, doing this doesn't come at no cost, but you gain charges for it by breaking enemy weak points and doing glory kills. Things that you'll almost definitely be doing anyways. So you'll have pretty solid uptime on this thing, and the game does expect you to use it often. And in instances where the game thinks you'll really need it, they're not afraid to just give you a charge for free either. Now, I do like that the hammer is more intimately involved in the resource management dance, which is something I described earlier as one of my favorite parts of the game overall. But as a result, it does represent a pretty major shift in Eternal's combat, since it is almost always the best option to top off your resources. I didn't find myself using the chainsaw much in this DLC, and I rarely used the flame belch or ice grenade in isolation. Nearly always I saved them up for a big top off with the hammer instead of using them for crumbs. This isn't a bad thing, it's just a neutral observation as to how different the hammer made the flow of combat. But it's also why I think this mechanic would have benefited from being introduced to the game earlier, so that it could more evenly be tuned to its existence down the stretch, instead of just immediately going all in on it in the DLC. I do generally vastly prefer this to the Crucible Sword though, and I wouldn't have minded if it replaced it outright. Now, the reason I had to get this out of the way is because this stun mechanic is interestingly employed in the Armored Baron and Marauder. Since these are enemies that can already be stunned by other means, the hammer has a unique mechanic for them where it will actually extend their stunned windows, making these otherwise pretty difficult and demanding enemies actually pretty simple. With Marauders specifically, I think a new mechanic offering a new way to interact with them is very welcomed because of how rigid they are otherwise, though a way to just kind of deal with them the same way but faster doesn't really address what I think are greater problems with them. I digress. I still overall appreciate the attempt to make this enemy more flexible. Now, the flip side of the coin is that the DLC is designed from here on out expecting that you will use this as part of your combat flow regularly, which means bigger groups of enemies, higher incidence of enemies that the game expects you to use the hammer to stun, and even enemies where the hammer kind of has to be used. I'm going to rapid fire through some other additions in this DLC that I have thoughts about, because although I do have strong opinions on some of this stuff, it doesn't really stick around for long enough to leave a very significant lasting impression. Cursed Prowlers are prowlers where if you get hit by their projectile, it will curse you, which distorts your vision, damages you over time, and restricts your ability to dash and use your meat hook until you can chase them down and score a blood punch on them. In the entire playthrough of this DLC, I got hit by this one time. But it still sucked and is, in my opinion, not a fun mechanic. Doom Eternal really has this obsession with taking things away from you somehow being engaging gameplay, and I just can't agree with that. It also sometimes feels like the interactions being encouraged here were decided by just like throwing darts at a board. Like, why does blood punching this guy clear the curse? I'd really prefer these specific interactions to trend at least a bit more intuitive than that. The Stone Imp is sort of like the Spirit. It's an imp, but reimagined as an enemy that really wants to be dealt with using one specific weapon mod, which in this case is the Combat Shotgun's automatic fire mode. Again, a previously pretty unpopular one, at least as far as I can tell. I personally rarely used it in my playthrough, except for on these guys. I do find them just a little less annoying than the Spirit, because you can just smash them with the hammer as well, which is kind of a theme with this DLC. Or you can still chainsaw them, so they still at least function normally as fodder enemies. Like, there's still some options here, but I definitely say they fall into that camp of their design feeling cynical, much like the Spirit. Yet another example of this is the Riot Soldiers, who fire faster than their shotgun-wielding counterparts, whose shields can also be broken by shooting them or exploded with the plasma rifle. Instead, these guys' shields are just unbreakable, and instead demand to only be attacked from their unshielded side, making the remote detonate for the rocket by far the best option in my experience. Once again, just a pretty uninteresting enemy that doesn't really add more for me than it takes away. Like, using the remote detonate was always an option for dealing with shielded enemies, and it was a weapon mod that I used pretty often. These guys just brute force it. Finally, the Screecher, which I will concede is an actually interesting addition in some capacity. Screechers are actually just zombies you don't want to kill. At least not early into a fight, because when you do, they'll emit a burst that briefly buffs surrounding enemies. I think having enemies you actually need to avoid is still a really interesting consideration, but on the flip side, anything using this game's pretty annoying buff mechanic is not too fun for me to engage with, honestly. It'd be one thing if it felt like it was always possible to avoid these guys through careful weapon selection, and it at least starts out that way. But down the stretch of the DLC, especially as it expects you to use the hammer more often, it gets progressively harder to avoid clipping one of them and suddenly buffing a whole arena of tough enemies. The double Marauder fight in the final level surrounded by Screechers was really one of the least fun encounters in the entire game for me as a result, and we already touched on just how janky fighting a buffed Marauder feels. Aside from World Spear being a really cool gauntlet with some of the game's best platforming, the other two levels here feel decidedly more by the numbers Doom Eternal than the first DLC, which took more interesting risks with level design. The second level, Reclaimed Earth, actually represents a return to parts of the first level, which is kind of neat, but otherwise it's just an okay level. The final level, Imora, offers top-notch spectacle and some really solid, challenging arenas, but overall feels a little bit short in its length and offers mainly just build up to the final boss. One more thing worth mentioning here before we wrap on part 2 is the escalation zones. These are arenas that can be refought with more difficult enemies as a challenge and to unlock cosmetics. While in general I miss the time trial challenges and Slayer gates here, I do think this is at least an interesting concept worth touching on and something I wouldn't mind seeing a return to in some capacity in Dark Ages. I think this is all really cool and offers a lot of replayability to experienced players. I think Eternal's DLCs double dip a little bit more than necessary, both being really challenging, balanced around experienced players, and also having some of the most challenging optional content as well. But I at least admire the effort to include challenging optional content in this context. I think that's never a bad thing for a game to have more of. We do have one thing left to talk about, and that is the Dark Lord boss fight, which as of right now represents the canonical last encounter of Doom and the climax of the entire DLC saga. And it pains me to say this, it just, once again, isn't very good. Now, the hyperbole around this fight was hard to ignore going into it. I didn't exactly know why people didn't like it, just that most people didn't like it very much. But what's wrong with it exactly remains to be seen. The Dark Lord is, in a lot of ways, basically a supercharged Marauder. Already you could imagine why that might be polarizing, but I am at least happy to say he isn't nearly as fast and aggressive as the Marauder. Generally speaking, he just functions in a similar way. He will shield most attacks so you can't damage him normally, and he will even heal himself a little bit if you do try to damage him carelessly. So you essentially have to stun him during his green flash attack to deal unblocked damage. Additionally, using the Sentinel Hammer, you can extend his stun window. Actually pretty cool how this plays in with this fight, since it easily could have been discarded like many other mechanics are in boss fights. That's about the extent of what good I have to say about this fight though, because while I think this is actually a solid idea on paper, much like the Gladiator, the execution is just not there. And the most unfortunate thing of all is that I don't actually think this fight was that far from being pretty good. The biggest problem here is just how long this fight tends to drag between you dealing damage. Were it more of an even and responsive exchange between you and the boss, I think it would feel a lot better. Much like the Marauder, there is an ideal range at which you can bait out this green flash attack, but he just won't always do it either. Dark Lord actually has a pretty large moveset at melee range, including some melee slices with his sword that just aren't counterable. If you get hit during these two, he heals, and like, a ton. There were times when I had him pretty low and just getting hit once or twice amounted to nearly a full heal for him. It'd be one thing if his attacks were just really easy to dodge, but they're not. Some of them have deceptive timings and hitboxes, and if you stay far enough away, he'll pepper you with lasers. Now, these aren't too bad and don't heal him, but at this range, you basically will never see the green flash attack. So it's kind of your indication to get back closer to him. Additionally, because you want to have armor, ammo, health, and sentinel hammer charges, this fight can be pretty resource intensive. The Dark Lord summons dogs like the Marauder, which when killed will drop hammer charges, so this is at least pretty nice, but again, this means just more waiting for him to do one specific attack. The fight has 5 health bars where you more or less repeat the same thing without too much change. Some attacks get added or get new mix-ups between phases, but largely the fight functions the same. In the final 2 phases, he'll summon a group of spectral demons occasionally. The game will tell you to use the hammer to get rid of them, and yeah, that makes it pretty easy since they basically just disappear. And even if you don't use the hammer, they die in way less hits anyways, but it's just another thing to use the hammer on and spend time dealing with. And it means waiting longer for more hammer charges. We're using the zombies around the arena to farm for glory kills, which means eyes off the boss as he flies towards you for a full heal to himself. Despite what I've said, this fight really isn't that hard, at least in my opinion. It's just completely tedious. It took me longer than the hardest Dark Souls 3 boss at level 1, and by almost double the time. It took me like 30 minutes to chip him down finally, and I genuinely only died a couple times, and it was mostly early on while I was still feeling out his moveset and gimmick. I think there are solid ideas here, and using your weaponry to interrupt his attacks and then stunning him with a giant hammer actually feels like it could be right at home in the upcoming Dark Ages. But as it is, this fight landed a mile away from being fun just due to how tedious it is to engage with, and that's a real shame. And actually, on the whole, this DLC got me thinking about the Dark Ages more again. I did kind of think these DLCs would mostly just be extreme riffs on Eternal's combat, but some ideas presented here kind of feel like they could be proto-experiments that could go on to become parts of Dark Ages combat. Or if even not, that in general, it just had so much fun designing a giant hammer, armored enemies whose mace attacks you parry to destroy their armor, big guys with swords and shields, and hell, Doom Guy even hops on a dragon at one point, because why not? That they just decided to go all in on making a medieval game. Either way, full approval from me. And all in all, despite the last fight being a letdown, this was a pretty good note to send off Eternal on for me. While I didn't enjoy the combat and levels overall quite as much as in part 1, a lot of this DLC just felt good and cool. And I think at its core, that is what is most important for Doom. And now with the last bit of Eternal's content done and dusted, we can truly look forward to the Dark Ages. Now, the purpose of this video was genuinely not to just farm interest and speculation in the Dark Ages. And I intend to take a much deeper look at this game once it's released, so for now, I'm going to keep this portion light. But I am just incredibly excited for this game, and have been since it was first announced, but even more so now that I've taken a really exhaustive look back at the road that got us here. Undeniably, Dark Ages looks to be another bold, but ultimately different take on what, on a broad, grand level, the concept of Doom even can be. And like Eternal, I'm sure it's going to upset a few people, but I'm ready for it. And after going back through 2016 and Eternal and its DLCs, I actually do think there are some threads to dissect and respond to just speculate what it might feel like to play the Dark Ages, and how fans of these previous entries might be satisfied by what's on offer there. I think bad news for the people who really don't care for the more rigid flow of combat in Eternal, where you're expected to engage with it in a specific way. It does kind of seem like Dark Ages may be like that again. The trailers show dealing with enemies sort of like the Armored Baron by parrying and stunning them, breaking their armor, and so on. I think if there's a few things that id clearly liked and thought were working well in Eternal that they've carried over, one of those things is enemy movesets that can be directly responded to. I know some people don't like how gamey and colorful Doom has trended over this past decade. They don't like the rainbow pinata of ammo or the stars over stunned enemies' heads, and I won't tell those people that they're wrong. But Dark Ages looks to have continued on celebrating these gamey aspects of Doom and communicating gameplay elements with bold colors and easily identifiable effects. To this end, though, responding to enemies in this game looks fun as hell. It looks visceral and it looks well communicated. I think while this is definitely different too, it does seem like a lot of lessons have been learned from Eternal. Experimentations with more and more powerful melee options there, and especially in the DLCs, amount to a full melee moveset and combat tuned more around engaging with melee. And I'm very excited to see how this will develop over the course of the game. I think another thing that's clearly been expanded from Eternal is just the scale of the world. Eternal has these levels that are like long and impressive, but still fairly narrow. And the moments where they open up are mostly for platforming. But Dark Ages looks like it genuinely has massive arenas that can be fully explored, which is pretty cool. Given my own general mixed feelings towards Eternal's platforming, I'm happy to see another new exploration of how space can be utilized and presented in these games, because goddamn, some of these environments look incredible. Most of all, Eternal's suite of weapons is like a direct development on 2016's, imagining how 2016's suite of weapon mods and alt-fires could be expanded into a diverse toolset where everything, or at least mostly everything, has a purpose. Dark Ages actually looks like a huge departure here, with a ton of weapons looking to be brand new, or maybe not completely new, but drastically different riffs on classic Doom weapons. So I am excited to see how this arsenal will play into combat, which looks to be more focused on melee than anything else, but from what I've seen so far, the guns seem to be less so involved in specific enemy counters and combos like in Eternal, but rather they seem far more important in how they factor into wrestling these big arenas with hordes of enemies, where flowing between taking care of big single targets and hordes of smaller demons will necessitate different approaches. At the heart though, and I already know some people will disagree with this, but I don't care. I look at what has been shown of Dark Ages so far, and I just see Doom. There will always be people saying, oh, Doom isn't this, Doom isn't that. It's not medieval, this looks like Quake, or whatever. But I'm just excited to see a new interpretation of Doom's world, weaponry, and iconic demons. I think 30 some odd years into this franchise's life, I'm just happy that they've chosen to keep pushing boundaries and exploring new territory. So Dark Ages, I can't wait. I'll be streaming my first playthrough live, and I hope to see you there. Now, I've wanted to make a video like this for a long time, but I honestly sat on it for a few reasons. For one, as a relative newcomer to Doom, I didn't feel like my opinions were really mature enough to have anything interesting to say, but this exhaustive revisit to modern Doom really changed things a lot. It not only solidified how I feel and what I want to say about these games, but it also just reaffirmed how much I appreciate and admire them. And while I did spend a lot of this video critiquing things I didn't like as much, I can't stress enough how much I prefer an awesome but prickly game that really challenges me, both mechanically and by introducing some elements with some real friction, for better or worse. And re-experiencing this jump from 2016 to Eternal really illuminated this to me. In general, I'm glad that somebody is making big and bold AAA FPS games when nobody else will, and I'm even more glad that it's id and Doom. If you watched to the end of this absolute beast of a video, just know that I appreciate you, and I hope to see more of you in the Dark Ages. Thanks for watching.
Hit that like
This is
button.
alright.
Smash that bell, hit that bell button, hit this
Destroy my
bell
pussy.
button.
Subscribe to Dumper Man.